You're listening to the Saving Elephants podcast, a place where millennials express and defend their conservative values in hopes of restoring the Republican Party. Join us as we reignite conservatism for millennials.
This episode of Saving Elephants marks two milestones. Not only is this the 200th episode, but the month of April marks 8 years of me recording this podcast. 8 years of tirelessly sharing the classical conservative message in hopes of restoring the Republican Party. I'm your host, Josh Lewis, and since this is 8 years into this project, I figured it was probably a good time to stop and reassess. Is the GOP worth saving? To answer that question, I have not one or even two, but three special guests, Shawn Whatley, Scott Howard, and Blake Fisher. All three no strangers to saving elephants, but I will introduce them in kind in our conversation as we explore the question, is the GOP still worth saving?
You're listening to the Saving Elephants Show.
I have wonderful panelists who are going to be joining us. I forewarned some they could show up a little late if they needed to or leave early, and I think they all took it to heart because we've just got a couple of waiting in the wings at the moment. But I'm going to introduce them here one at a time. So far, we have Shawn Whatley of the aptly named, you couldn't squeeze it all in, it looks like, but Concepts with Shawn Whatley is the name of his show. I'd highly recommend it. Shawn, always good to have you on the show.
Great to be back.
And welcoming Scott Howard. Scott, it's been a while since we've had you on, and I think, if I've got this right, since we've had you on last, you now have a new gig, managing editor of New Guard Press. Am I right about that?
Yes, you are. It's a pleasure to be on again. And I'll take the moment to congratulate you on 8 years. Saving Elephants has been a fond of mine. I've known you about 6 now, so congratulations. Here's to 8 more.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. I am totally cool with that. I shudder to think about those first 2 years. I'm glad that they're so far down the algorithms, almost nobody ever sees those anymore. I think even having the first 3 episodes, I did like a prequel saying, hey, feel free to skip ahead if this is a little too cringeworthy for you. But man, I cannot believe it has been 8 years. It's been 10 since the infamous, Trump coming down the golden escalators, apocryphal perhaps, but sort of a 10-year marker, if you will, of when it looked like maybe the conservative movement changed in a bit. Now, I often say, and I really believe this, that's just, I think, the symbolism that sort of put words around the thing that was probably happening, bubbling under the surface for many years prior to. It wasn't, this whole thing does not begin or end with Donald Trump. But I do think that there is a need within the conservative movement, say, to call the Republican Party back to its roots. It was not perfect. It never was perfect. It never will be perfect. But I do think that there is a need for those of us who share a, say, classical conservative tradition to remind people, that this is an alternative from the path it's been on. And so I do want to open it up here with sort of that, there are a number of other panels who will be joining us later that may have very differing views. I have heard from some people saying, why bother with the GOP at all? If you're a conservative, shouldn't you have been out of that long ago? Others say, I don't see what the problem is. Like the GOP was in need of sort of an update, if you will, and Trump brought new voters onto the roll. We're now successful. We were, in other words, you didn't like the direction that the Romneys and the McCains were taking us, right? This is an improvement. So I guess I wanted to start off by just doing a pulse check with both of you gentlemen. Where would you say, in this 8-year project, if you will, is it ill-fated? Is conservatism in need of being reinfused, say, with the GOP? Is the GOP worth saving, and is it even possible to save the GOP?
So I'll take a stab at this first. The short answer is that yes, the GOP is worth saving, and that conservatives should still consider it their home, if not the most natural, compared to, say, the 1980s. And for 2 reasons. One, practically speaking, politics is a dirty business. It always has been. Even in our best years, politics it's not a genteel craft. So nothing's going to be perfect. And even with the disruptions of the last decade, relative to the alternatives, the GOP remains the most practical instrument for conservative intellectuals and thinkers and people to achieve their policy aims. And the second arm of that is that if you look below the national level, the GOP remains a profoundly conservative party in many parts of the country. Here in Florida, the GOP remains staunchly conservative. It has achieved concrete conservative aims in ways that classically conservative-minded people would like to see. Georgia's the same way. The Carolinas are very much the same way. All across the nation, you find states like this. So the disruption that we cringe at is largely at a national level. And if you look below that, there's still lots in the GOP for us to look positively on.
So great comments. Building on that, I want to compliment you too, Josh, on 8 years. It feels like you've been doing this a lot longer. And full disclosure, flattery. What is it? The best compliment is flattery. Imitation is flat.
Oh yeah.
How do you say it?
Highest form imitation is the highest form of flattery, I think.
Yeah, you got it. All right, there you go. Imitation's highest form of flattery. So not to say that I've achieved an imitation of your podcast yet, but certainly your content and your approach certainly was an inspiration for me starting this. So just so the audience knows, I'm hailing from Canada, although my family spread all across the United States, and my background's healthcare, governance, leadership, medical politics, and then from there, how can we transform the world so that people can escape the socialist approach to medicine that we have in Canada? But it means that we have to think long and hard on politics and philosophy. So your question is about the GOP. And in some ways, I look at the United States and I think, man, it'd be so easy if you guys just have one of two buckets. Either you're on the left or you're on the right. And if you're on the right, you support the right and you're done. The problem is, though, and I'll steal a line from George Nash. He said, we have to avoid the sectarian temptation. He said, deviationism is something that the Stalinist left uses, right? If you're not on board with us, if you deviate at all from the party line, we're going to kick you out. And so it's fascinating to watch. I say north of the border, we're south of the border all the time, but it's fascinating to watch how it seems like instead of changing electoral parties so much, you change the sectarian message within the party itself. And that's what I see Trump as. At least initially, it seemed like, okay, whoa, this is a real change from the old GOP to the new GOP, and you have the never Trumpers, etc. But now you start wondering, well, has he slid back into a 1990s, early 2000s kind of GOP kind of flavor with his, intervening in countries? So when you say, is the GOP worth saving? Of course, GOP is the main vehicle to get things done. Of course, conservatives need to be there. But again, as a semi-outsider, we'll say, I do worry about the sectarian temptation. I don't think the GOP has overcome that. It seems like it's all about who can get in, get control, and then stamp out all the other voices. Well, that makes for a very boring politics. I think young people especially, they want to see some life and debate and discussion of real ideas as opposed to saying, no, this is the only way that we see things now. So I'm just throwing that out there. I don't know if it's too provocative, but that's my sense of the GOP. Support it, but stop being so sectarian.
My congressman here, first district in Oklahoma, is running for senator. Kevin Hearn. He's running for senator because Markwayne Mullin is leaving the Senate to be DHS appointee. And in his initial ad, Kevin Hearn, running for Senate, essentially said, "Look, I'm going to help ensure that President Donald Trump's MAGA America First agenda gets passed." And he kept going on about these rhino Republicans in the Senate who are stopping this agenda from getting through. And during this ad, at some point, as he's mentioning rhino Republicans, you see three figures in the background: Chris Christie, Liz Cheney, and is either Adam Kinzinger or somebody else. Anyhow, what I thought was interesting about it is none of those individuals, it's fair to say they're anti-Trump, say Republicans, none of them were ever in the Senate. So it was like, who are you talking about? Who is this last holdout that if we could just convince them to all sing hands around the campfire, singing Kumbaya, we could fix all problems, if you will. And I think within that vein, I think there's also a lesson for a person such as myself, because I think sometimes it's easy to sort of imagine, well, what will happen in the future is we're going to have this messianic candidate that's going to right the ship. And we're going to be able to sweep under the rug the last 10 years as if they never happened. And to varying degrees, I think sometimes you'll see that and say like a Nikki Haley or a Ron DeSantis. Well, they're not Trump, right? Maybe they're not going to disavow the January 6th nonsense, but they're not Trump. So they're getting us closer. And to be completely frank, I would prefer a Haley or DeSantis presidency over a Trump presidency. But I guess part of what I'm noodling through here is over these last 8 years, something that does seem to have changed, sometimes seismically and sometimes almost imperceptibly, is very early on into the Trump's takeover of the GOP in 2016, you still had plenty of senators, even Ted Cruz among them, who would stand up to Trump and essentially say this is not conservatism. That has changed sizably in a sense, and I think I would even say post the January 6th incursion on the Capitol, you saw a GOP that very cowardly, in my view, said, well, what's the big deal? This guy's on his way out. Why bother with an impeachment and removal from office? Surely he would never be president again. and here we are. He's president again. And so it kind of leaves in my mind this sort of unreconcilable problem I think we have in our near future, is that there is a grave temptation on the one hand to sort of pretend like none of this ever happened. And everything's just going to magically snap back to normal once Trump's out of the way. I think there's also a grave temptation to say, well, until we burn it all down and destroy from the GOP everyone who had anything to do with Trump, then it's not pure enough for me to support. I don't claim to know the answer of where exactly one is supposed to find themselves between those two extremes. And so maybe I'm coming to you guys. Do you agree with those sort of parameters? And if so, where ought one to try to position themselves if they want to restore the GOP?
I'll take another swing at that. As somewhere in the middle of those polls is correct. My position, one that I would recommend to folks, is that to restore the GOP, you must actively participate in it. You must consider yourself a Republican and act as a Republican, even if it's disaffected, right? You see a lot of no true Scotsman behavior, both from the MAGA camp and from the anti-Trump camp, and that the people who are anti-Trump doing it do their cause no service. Like it or not, the GOP remains a viable party in the nation. Trump as a viable figurehead, elected with a majority vote in 2024, despite everything he did in the preceding 8 years leading up to this election. Right? Despite all of this, the American people, a near unanimous vote from the Republicans themselves and a sizable chunk of independents, said, despite all this, we're going to put him back in the office. You do have to grapple with that reality and participate in those parameters. Now, you shouldn't give up and say none of this matters. It's just these are just the new rules of the game. We can actively work to reform the party, but you have to have a seat at the table if you want to play the game and if you want to change the rules. I think a lot of people in the sort of anti-Trump camp lose sight of that. They have decided that their own moral purity is more important to themselves than making concrete, practical changes that might require you to get your hands dirty in the arena.
Yeah, Josh, I'm so glad you set us up with that question. So, like the typical nerd that I am here, so my Democracy in America here, 2 volumes, and so I'm reading from book 2, volume 2, part 1, chapter 2, and this de Tocqueville is a genius, right? 25 years old when he came to the States, and volume 2 was published when he was 34, 35. So, I mean, I'm so jealous of this guy. But I got to read one line. He said, "One can foresee that faith in common opinion will become a sort of religion whose profit will be the majority." And so this is a hard question you asked, Josh. I mean, and Scott too. I think we're all kind of really excited about ideas. Got to get in there, be at the table, share our ideas, have debates. And if Tocqueville's right, he said, in a time of equality, you don't have people talking about general ideas. And he uses the example of the British, who really have actually a distaste for general ideas. He said, so in a time of equality, I think I'm just as smart as you, Josh. Josh, you think you're just as smart as me. And so I feel free to disagree with you. But if we have Josh and Scott and everybody else and they're all having the same opinion, and it's not my opinion. I think, well, geez, I'm just as smart as all of them, and they're all just as smart as me. And now there's 20 of them, and they're all saying the same thing. So clearly I should go with their opinion. So in a weird sort of way, according to Tocqueville, in a democratic environment, when we have this presupposition of equality, we don't have elites, we don't have aristocrats. We're actually anti-elites on the populist right. Oh, down with elites, to burn them all down. We actually end up in a weird kind of tyranny of opinion. We often hear tyranny of the majority, right? The majority is going to vote in something, but it's actually tyranny of the opinion based on the presumption or the presupposition of equality. Because I think I'm just as smart as you, and now there's 10 of you, well, I'm just as smart as you and you're just as smart as me, so therefore I need to go with your opinion if all 10 of you are agreeing on something. And so I think that's a better explanation of how we're seeing change, not just in the GOP, but in Hungary and Canada, wherever we see the right. And I'm not sure the right fully understands that this is what's driving change in politics. We love to think ideas have consequences, right? Richard Weaver. But yes, they do, but not as much consequences as we would hope. It's actually popular figures that come in, just like you said, Josh. Someone's going to come in and just change everything and put down the last 10 years down a memory hole. Well, that's how Trump got power in the first place. He swayed popular opinion. And so when you get into his second term, people like Ted Cruz go very quiet. Oh, we're not going to criticize this. He's got popular opinion on his side. And that's exactly what Tocqueville predicted. Again, the guy's a genius. I'm so jealous of this guy. And so I don't know that we on the right have really wrapped our heads around the power of popular opinion as a political tool in the age of equality. We still are wedded to well, Josh has read a lot of books and I heard his debate on, Strauss versus Burke. And so that makes good sense. Or Jonah Goldberg, I heard him. He made some really good comments. We're going to go with that. I don't think that's the way politics is working at all, and perhaps has ever worked in America or in North America. So I'll just throw that out there. I'm not sure if you guys like Tocqueville or not, or go ahead, Scott. Trash Tocqueville.
I'm not gonna trash talk though. He's a genius. Any Frenchman who can look at America in the 1820s and predict the Cold War has earned my undying respect. Quite intelligent. I think you're right about the nature of politics today, and truthfully, for most of American history, it has been the leveling of democracy has created a sort of a world in which popular opinion creates itself, right? The inertia of a critical mass of people believing something adds to it. Trump is not the first figure to take advantage of this. He will not be the last. Going back to something Josh said earlier about the anti-Trumpers sitting on the sidelines waiting for our own messianic figure to come in and form the GOP. I think that contributes to the problem at hand, in that if Trump is a messianic figure for the folks that were considered fringe in 2014 and prior, sitting here waiting for our own figure to rise like that and bring the GOP back to the glory days does not substantively change the problems inherent in that type of politics. We've just substituted Trump for our own person. And we can't get rid of all of this sort of tyranny of popular opinion, as Shawn put it. But if we participate incrementally, we can buttress that with some level of, meritocracy of ideas, and that these things are the way we should do things because they're intelligent, and the way they're prudent, and these are the timeless ideas of conservatives of old, coupled with a persuasive figure who can bring those ideas back into the fray. You have to have both.
I think that we're done a disservice in the sense that I am adamantly opposed to populism as, say, a governing ideological framework. But that doesn't mean that I think all forms of populism are bad or wrong. And as perhaps both of you are suggesting, if I'm hearing you correctly, you can't really get rid of them. It's the goal of saving elephants has never been to get every American to sit and ponder, I wonder what Edmund Burke would say about this. might love that, but that ain't going to happen. It's just not. Oh, by the way, before I get too carried away here, you have a fan here, Scott. I'm not sure if you'd recognize him or not, but it says, hi, Scott. So I thought I'd give him a shout out. Thank you for everyone who's watching. If you have a pertinent question for the group, feel free to participate. We'd love to hear from you guys. But it made me think of and I'm not completely sold. I'm about 80% with Matthew Continetti's interpretation on this, not 100%. But in his book, The Right, he essentially kind of makes this argument that Ronald Reagan was a populist in a certain sense. He spoke a populist language, he had a populist appeal. Now, here we don't mean populism as sort of down with elites, but rather sort of I am one of you. I'm not an elite. I'm just one of you guys, and I'm going to speak to you in a manner that not so much I'm stooping down to not use fancy words, but rather I'm speaking to your actual needs and desires and hopes and aspirations. And I think too of it wasn't Wilmore Kendall. I think it was Irving Kristol. There we go. In his book, he talked a great deal about how actually sometimes the populist or popular sentiment can be healthy in a nation. It is the very thing that thwarts oftentimes radical leftist ideologues from implementing their ideas. It turns out your average American family really doesn't care that much about workers of the world uniting. They just want to put food on their table and take care of their own. And that sort of has a moderating effect. Maybe they're not reading Edmund Burke, but they're not reading Karl Marx either. And that creates sort of a, let's say, center-right populism that a conservative culture can very much admire. I'm going to continue with my thought, but before I do, I'm going to welcome the stage here, Blake Fisher.
Hi.
Oh, Blake, it sounds like we may have some feedback in the mic.
Okay, I'll figure that out. Give me a second.
All right. Let's see. I'm going to put you on mute for just a second as I finish that thought, then I'll bring you back in here. We'll talk to Blake here in just a moment. But I guess where I'm going with that is I've never found a good way to put words around this. When I desire a Reagan-esque type figure, not as a messianic figure that's just going to sweep all this under the rug and fix it, but rather what I want is someone who's not like me leading the charge. I'm never going to be able to speak like a Trump or a Reagan or heck any other guy we've elected president the last 100 years, right? I'm too infatuated with Burke to talk to normal humans. Sometimes I would like to think, or at least that's what my mom tells me. I guess what I want is not so much a disavowing of populism, but rather a populism that still upholds a moral framework. And here I really do think it is entirely appropriate to look at run-of-the-mill Americans and say, this is wrong. It's not that you need to know who Edmund Burke was, but you do need to have the capacity to recognize when you have a genuine demagogue, a con man, an individual who is lying, who is behaving in a way that is you wouldn't want any member of your family behaving. You have a moral duty to say, I may not understand all the contours of political philosophy, but this stinks. This is not something I think we should be involved with. And I don't mean by that politics is always a popularity contest of who is the most moral among us. But I do think we have certain moral taste buds that when there's a very different populism that say that looks for a Ronald Reagan versus a Donald Trump. Not that Reagan was, again, a perfect moral figure. But there is a very sort of self-serving, might makes right, power grab. The United States is what they call carnage, American carnage. And so therefore we need to do what we can to grab what's ours and screw the rest of the world, if you will. That's very different than a sort of city on a hill approach that we saw under a Reagan administration. And so I guess my great hope is that podcasts such as Saving Elephants and other shows and organizations that you gentlemen are involved in would do our part to try to be that middle bridge, if you will, between the eggheads and those who can kind of listen to a podcast or read a book and then develop their own moral taste buds so that they can communicate to their friends and their families, hey, this doesn't look right. This doesn't sound right. I think it takes all of us kind of working in that way. There may be a question buried in there somewhere, but I'm going to see again if we can get Blake back here on the stage. Blake,
is this better now?
Hear us?
Yes.
That is much better.
Okay, I opened the wrong browser. It's my own stupid fault. So I apologize.
I'm amazed because you always have the most professional looking recording set up around you.
I try to, but sometimes with more equipment becomes more problems. That's kind of part of the technology deal when you do audio engineering, is that there's always, more things to break.
That's fair enough. So, Blake, I'm going to let you kind of seamlessly transition within the conversation, but I'll also open it up to Shawn and Scott, since I've been monologuing for a while. If you have any thoughts on, if you want to riff off anything I just said, or if we should move on.
No, I made notes, but I want to let Scott go. Oh no, Blake wants to go.
No,
Go
go.
ahead.
I was going to
Go
say,
ahead.
I'm curious to hear what y'all say, because I was going to say, I think you could speak a little better than some of the presidents of the last 100 years, Josh, just so you're aware. I think you could probably do it better than some of them.
Well, okay. Well, maybe.
So Josh, I'm going to jump in here. I made a couple notes. So you said you loved Ronald Reagan. I love Ronald Reagan too. I mean, gosh, I love that guy. And I mean, he had some pretty Democrat kind of flavorish ideas, even when he was in office. We could criticize his spending record. We could criticize a whole bunch of things about him. But the thought came to mind, and this is, I apologize, super nerdy. On Sundays, I always read my nerdiest stuff. So I was just reading Cicero, and Cicero talked about, and I'm going to mispronounce these names because I'm not an academic, but the populares versus the optimates. Is that right? So the politicians who appealed to the popularity and gave the people what they wanted in order to win power versus the politicians who really tried to display the kind of character that you were talking about, Josh, and appealing to the ideal and the moral high ground, shall we say. And those were the optimates. I'm not pronouncing the Latin correctly, but even back to Cicero, we have this fundamental divide between an appeal to populism or an appeal to popularity in order to win power for ourselves versus trying to convince the voting public that we have something that is worth supporting. And so then you have political statesmanship as a form of leadership, where you go out and you try to convince people of your platform, even if it's not interesting at the start. But I can I make a comment about Continetti? I loved his book too. You started with Continetti's book.
Yeah.
And isn't he married? Isn't he like a son-in-law of Bill Kristol now or something?
He is, yeah. He's married into neoconservatism.
Yeah, so he's royalty now. And so now that you've introduced him, we're not allowed to bash neoconservatism. I was hoping we could criticize that a bit.
Are you
just for
kidding?
fun.
Everyone is allowed to bash neoconservatism.
So you mentioned Irving Kristol. I mean, I love that guy. So the old Kristols were great, and they had a lot of the stuff that you were talking about, the moral high ground and actually caring about culture. They were 1950s liberals essentially, but they cared about something of substance. Whereas now, and I want you guys to explain this, what the heck is Bill Kristol supporting Mom Danny for? Like, what's going on? So I better stop there because I'm ranting and raving now, but you set me up for that one.
I won't comment on Bill Kristol. We could spend the whole night bashing him. I agree with much of what Shawn just said. As he was talking, a line from an Abraham Lincoln biography that I read popped into my head that I think adequately addresses the various types of populism that we're discussing, what a good populist leader looks like and what a bad one does. A bad one, as Shawn mentioned, appeals to the base sensibilities of the people, gives them what they want, and treats that as an end in and of itself, or as a means to achieve personal gratification. Right? You see many sort of lower populist leaders, the types of populism we would think are bad, use this sort of mantra of "I'm for the people" to satisfy their own corrupt ends. The line from the Lincoln biography, and this is not something Lincoln said, I don't think, or wrote down, but this was an idea that the biography said that he kept in mind. That I think if you look at his career, it's very clear that he had some conception of this. That the role of a statesman is to satisfy the people's ignoble but not immoral desires, so as to raise them to a higher moral standard on whatever the moral issue of the day is. And for Lincoln, that was slavery. Lincoln was a populist leader, broadly understood. From the frontier, the log cabin man, right? All of these affectations that we associate with early American populism. And there were a lot of issues in which he checked his own personal parochial ideas in the face of popular passions, right? Certain political positions that he may have taken personally, but he would not take publicly because he understood they were losers. And he did that because they may not have been the greatest of positions in his mind. They weren't immoral. But on the one great immoral issue of his day, he stood his ground. And in his ability to trade that off, he was able to raise the national standard to a level that eventually, during his presidency, we could end that great moral tragedy of slavery. And I think that's something that's the type of populism that we should be looking for. That's what I think Reagan did. That's what Lincoln did. You go back to Henry Clay, right? Henry Clay, this great Whig leader, was a populist in this sort of mold. Teddy Roosevelt had this sort of idea of populism. Right? These are the right types of populism versus the sort of lower, I'm going to speak the language of the people and use their power for my own ends.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of you have hit on something that is, it's not that, I mean, I generally don't think it works because inevitably populism, even if you wrap it, like I said, those are all examples of people going, okay, I can use the passions of people and I can figure out how to like get rid of slavery. You know what I mean? It's like, they were like, the other thing that Lincoln and Reagan and some of these other people did so well was explain like complicated things in simple ways so that the mass population could understand it. You know, it wasn't super nerdy or wonky where you're losing people. And it also wasn't just this sort of hitting people over the head with a baseball bat either, that I feel like all politics is now. Is we've got to find the common denominator that gets all the people riled up. And that now is just anger and tribalism is all that anyone's doing with populism now, essentially. It's like those people are the bad people and we've got to do whatever we can to defeat those people. And that's like where Crystal is, I think now. It's like he's decided that Trump is so, but like I said, I don't understand the thread to get to Mamdani. That doesn't make any sense to me. I get that, like, if you want to vote for Democrats to get people out of Congress that aren't standing up to Trump that are Republicans, like I would say we should fire everyone in Congress. We can do that every 2 years. We can fire all of them in the House of Representatives and a third of the Senate. We choose not to, though. Like that would be fine. But like Mamdani as mayor in New York doesn't make any sense. Like you're not a conservative if you at all. Like there's no way that you can write that thread that says, but it's because he's like been so anti-Trump and anti what the Republican Party has come is like, well, this is the guy. Instead of going, why don't we try to find good Republicans or good conservatives, even if that means we're losing for a while? Like that's like, that would be principled or whatever. But I think that's the problem, is that no one's really able to articulate in a simple enough way that the masses can understand, because that is a skill, and that we really have not had. I don't know that we've had a politician that really could do it since Clinton. I think Obama was he was very populist too, obviously. And it was still kind of like, oh, they're holding you back. And like it's like, there was always some there's always some they, which I joke it always ends up being the Jews, of course. I mean, like no matter what, like every thread you pull on that ends up being the Jews. But, I think that's the biggest problem, is we just really haven't had someone talented. I think unfortunately, my dream, of course, which is totally shot, is I was like, okay, well, we've got this craziness. We keep ping-ponging back and forth. We think the president's the most important thing in the world, and it's not. We should be thinking about other things. But I thought, okay, maybe by 2032, we could have like a real conservative. It's like, if we do this one more time, because I think inevitably a Democrat will win the White House in 2028. This is like a few years ago. I'm thinking, okay, like maybe by 2032, people realize that like this is not working. And we keep picking really bad messengers and people with really no ideals behind what they're saying. It's really just about personal power and stuff. And I thought that could be, like someone like Ben Sass in 2032. And unfortunately, he's dying of cancer. So it's not going to be him, but he's the only one that I've seen in the last decade that is good at, he's a really smart guy. He's obviously incredibly educated, knows a ton, but he can distill things down to a really simple way. Like his articles, his op-eds, and like how he fixed the Senate and stuff were like really like, I don't think anyone would read that and not understand like these are good ideas. Just doesn't seem like anyone's talking about ideas though.
I too very much bemoan. I don't know, sometimes I think some of the best senators or legislators will say don't necessarily make the best executives. So I have no idea. I have an enormous amount of respect for Ben Sass.
No idea either. I just wanted someone with the ideas. You know what I mean? I just wanted someone to be talking about ideas again, and it doesn't seem like people want that. But I think
I did a couple of years ago have a former Governor Mitch Daniels on the podcast, and I know he's getting up in years, but I pointed out to him that hey, in 2028, you're going to be as old as like Trump and Biden are now. Like, you think you'd be old enough to run for president? But he didn't seem to think he would want to do that.
Someone like him would be great too. He's another great example of someone that like actually can speak and make sense of like ideas that people go, oh, that makes sense, but not a chance.
Let me ask. So I want to direct us here, because we've mentioned the crystals, right? Irving and Bill, not to be confused, two very different crystals. But Bill Kristol was one. And by the way, Shawn, I don't know the answer to your question why he supports Mamdani. I mean, I could guess, but I'm with Blake. Is like, you could want to burn down the entire Republican Party. What does that have to do with wanting an avowed socialist to be elected? That seems very odd. That being said, let's evoke Bill Kristol here just for a second as sort of an avatar for an alternative. And I kind of mentioned this earlier in the conversation, because, you know, he was one of the founders, chief founders perhaps, of the Bulwark, kind of these twin, let's call them jointly Trump skeptical media organizations that emerged over the last several years, the Bulwark and the Dispatch. It's interesting because my super Trumpy friends, let me be charitable, those who are more favorable to Trump than I am, collapse these two as if they're essentially the same thing. And maybe I'm guilty of, you know, the differences of, or what is that phrase, of some of the small differences,
something in kind, or I can't remember. Yeah, whatever.
Something like, you know, if you got two different Baptists together, might get in a fist fight over something, but if it's a Baptist and a Catholic,
animosity has small differences.
Thank you. There you go.
That's it. Yep.
So those of us collectively, let's say on the Trump skeptical side of the ledger, I think both fit within the Dispatch or the Bulwark framework. The Bulwark began under the phrase conservatism conserved, right? It's this idea that conservatism or the Republican Party is being taken over by a con man, and we're going to hold the line. And I think, and I'm not trying to do them a disservice, because I don't know that they would disagree that they've ventured, if you will, from that original mission. They seem to have more of a mindset of, look, you guys are a bit naive. You don't understand how far gone things are. And we have to make common cause with the Democratic Party, because we are looking at an existential threat to American democracy. And so I want to open that possibility. Now, again, I don't have an enormous amount of respect for Bill Kristol. I historically, yes, the guy was very intelligent. I think he did a lot of amazing things. I'm not trying to just use Bill Kristol as the avatar for this entire mindset, but let's go with that for a moment. Are we potentially naive? Are we being too gentle, trying to say we're trying to save the Republican Party, when we could, in fact, be looking at the existential threat of the entire American experiment?
Well, I mean, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, I think part of the problem, though, is that I just looked it up, by the way. Neither one of them mentioned the word conservative, I think, anymore on them, which I think it's because that word has become just as, it's like conservative, Republican. It's the same thing now. It doesn't mean anything different to most people, unfortunately. And so I think that's part of the problem. But I also think that the Bulwark has leaned into their audience, which they realize I don't think is that, like I said, I think most of them are probably voting for Mamdani or whatever. I mean, it's kind of weird. I don't know. That audience capture thing is a weird thing that happens in media, obviously, in today's kind of social media podcast world. And it's hard to tell where the motivation is. I can't take off my audience, or this is really something I believe now and I've changed my mind. Because, like, to be fair, you know, his dad, Irving Kristol, is the whole neocon thing was, because you're right, these were ex-Democrats, kind of 50s liberals that moved over because they said this is not working. And so that's, I think, kind of happening now. What's weird to me, though, is that they're not really, it doesn't seem like they're embracing something that they're like, wait, this isn't what I stand for. They never stood for any of these things that the people they're supporting are now. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. It does seem like the Bulwark, I mean, just for me, balls and strikes, it seems like they are a little bit more in the can for the audience capture thing. The Dispatch seems to be a little bit more of a place where they're like, we have principles. It doesn't seem anyone cares about them, but like, that's just my opinion of it. I don't know. So I think that conservative Republican thing is a problem, is that the word conservative just means Republican to most people. And I think the truth is, like, left and right don't mean anything anymore. They really don't. Now that we've got, like, to me, the horseshoe theory thing is proven out how wacky we get on the far ends of what we call the right and the left and how they almost line up entirely. And you see, it's just, it's like different program. It's a different social welfare program. It's a different corporatism. But it's the same thing. It's just in different clothes. And what's weird to me is I think a lot of people understand that they don't like that, but they don't have anywhere to turn, right? Like it doesn't seem like there's anyone not doing one of those two things right now. So I don't know how, and I do think there's an existential kind of thing. It's not, I don't buy into this is the next election, it's the Flight 93 stuff. That stuff is BS. I think it was always bad. And I don't think it's like this next election goes this way or the country's over, which has been said my entire adult voting life. I mean, literally every single election has been the most important election of my life. I just happened to live through all these really important elections. It's a really great coincidence. And so I think we got to tell people what the problems are. I think the biggest problem with that is that the second one side says that, they only say that when they're not the ones in power. And then everything's great, even though, and so it just becomes the same kind of tribalism. It just becomes another thing where they're the bad guys. If they win, the country will be over. And that's how we're thinking of it. We're thinking of it as one side versus the other. We're not really thinking of it like, hey, the First Amendment doesn't maybe mean as much as it used to because both the last two presidents have kind of squashed it in some ways, or pick any of the Constitution, pick any of the like rule of law, pick any of the just norms, pick any of the institutions that have kind of rotted. I mean, just pick any of those things. And I think it can kind of be something, it's like the debt to me. It's like people just kind of keep going, well, it hasn't been a problem yet. You keep talking about this. People have been talking about the debt's going to be a problem for 26 years now or whatever. Literally, that's also been happening my entire adult life. But I mean, we're going to be at like what, 36, 39 trillion or something like that in the next couple of years. It will happen at some point that will be a problem. It is inevitable that it will be. But while it's not affecting people like right now, and I think they go, well, the country's not over. They look at their own lives, and a lot of people, problems, economics, whatever. Sure, there's some hard times, but they don't see any sort of writing on the wall that says the country's going to end. But I think it can happen really quickly. And I think that's what I'm worried about is, it could even be something like we haven't, I think, a huge difference in America and like Russia and China. We haven't really seen China tested, but it's very clear that like Russia's foray into the Ukraine did not go as well militarily as like ours into Iran. Now, I think that there's all sorts of problems I have with the way we've done the Iran stuff, but it's very clear that like we were not paper tigers going into this thing. And we're like, oh my gosh, military performed well. I don't think we have great plans, but that's a different story. But you could see a situation where you get spread too thin and all of a sudden we've got a situation where one of those countries defeats us or something. I mean, like there are like to me, a few steps you could like write that story pretty easily right now, whether it's militarily or it's the fiscal situation. Like there are a lot of situations that I think are sort of maybe not end of America, but sort of like big crises that could really change things. I tend to think those things would wake people up and realize that we've been playing a silly game for a really long time. I think it tends to happen. World War II was a similar kind of situation. You had a bunch of isolationists until you get attacked by Japan. And like it changes everything. Like, so one thing can change people's minds. It can change the entire layout of politics. I don't want it to be something bad, but I really do think it will have to be something bad to get us out of this rut.
Josh, can I jump in there on Crystal? Can we go back? Yeah, awesome. So Blake, I like your comments about you said conservative. What the heck does that label even mean now?
Yeah.
This was a breakthrough for me just a little while ago, and it's actually an old book, Daniel Mahoney's book, The Conservative Foundations of the Liberal Order, and chapter 6. I don't know if you guys already knew this. I didn't know this, and I'm a slow learner. Maybe I read it and I forgot it. But anyways, he talks about two neoconservatisms. I don't know if you guys have heard anyone talk about this.
I have not, no.
Yeah. So he says the first neoconservatism, to your point, Blake, you just said 1950s liberals, they were upset. They were really anti-totalitarian. So communism was the big enemy. We're going to fight that. We don't want so much state spending. We're worried about the decay in culture. So that's first neoconservatism. That's Podderetz and Commentary Magazine. I believe Public Interest, right, too, Irving Kristol. And I think there's a ton to like about these guys. Really smart. I don't I worry a little bit that they leaned too heavily on the academics and let's just have academics fix everything in society. So there was a managerial flavor to these guys as well, but they weren't the second neoconservatives. And by the way, Mahoney, I think he's a Straussian, at least that's his background. Straussians were Leo Strauss was often looked to as sort of the big brains animating a lot of the ideas on the first wave of neoconservatives. But Daniel Mahoney here talks about second neoconservatism. I thought this was brilliant. He said what we see in the second conservatives, or the second neoconservatism, is that they were much more concerned about a global democratic order. So they had a neo-Wilsonian flavor to them. So Wilson, of course, he's the big baddie boo-boo in American politics. He went out and wanted to change the world. He's going to use his big brain to bring managerial control and show people how politics is supposed to be done. Obviously, I'm extrapolating, and feel free to push back on anything I've just said. And this is Mahoney here. He says, few of the older neoconservatism's concerns about the pernicious spiritual and cultural effects of a fully democratized polity and culture, or its hesitations about dogmatic support for human rights in its foreign policy, were part of the new concerns. So really, they dropped off the whole 1950s cultural aspect. They were much more concerned about spreading democracy globally. They're much more concerned about taking control, and really it's almost a stripped down liberalism. So it's no longer a 1950s liberalism. It's more like a bread and butter modern liberalism, where anything that sets itself up, so America first, no, that's wrong on principle, because America first presupposes that we're not talking about global democracy anymore. So we should oppose that. If I'm Bill Kristol, I'm not Bill Kristol, but I thought that was brilliant. Chapter 6, Daniel Mahoney's Conservative Foundations of a Liberal Order. I don't consider myself a Straussian. I do like reading Strauss, but I've never seen that anywhere else. So I just thought I'd throw that out there. If you guys think it's great, super, trash it if you want.
I know Scott hasn't gotten a word in a bit, and I'll let you hear in a second, but just to muddy the waters even further, Matthew Continetti talks about 3 waves of neoconservatism. And I think in the way you're describing it, it fits within that framework, but he divides it up. I think there's a middle one in the 1970s and had more to do with the response in Vietnam. But what was interesting is, and kind of to your point, Irving Kristol, the godfather of neoconservatism, in reading his book, his biography, or rather it's a section of a series of essays he's written, neoconservatism. It's the anthropology of an idea. I'm blanking on the name of it. I feel terrible, but I should know. There's something.
You got a few books behind you. We'll forgive you for not remembering the titles of all of them.
Yeah. I'll get to it in a second. But reading that entire book, it struck me that I found a single paragraph that had anything to do with international policy, or even the notion of the spreading of the American idea through something like warfare. In other words, the very thing that we associate often, for understandable reasons, in the war in Iraq and Afghanistan with, say, the neocon view, is something that he had devoted no more than a single paragraph to in a massive book he had written. Now, Kristol's neoconservatism, he never disavowed FDR. He never disavowed the Great Society. He never disavowed liberal tinkering, if you will, from an academic perspective. He was pro-healthcare plan and any number of things that I find a little icky. He had a problem with LBJ. In other words, it was sort of well, if it doesn't work, why are we doing it? But if it works, then let's do it. I'm more Hayekian and far more skeptical of central planning. But I always give the old neocons at least credit for running the math and trying to, well, if this isn't working, let's at least try something different. And I think this is a good picture sometimes of Bill Buckley's magazine, National Review. I don't know who wrote it, but they had a very famous article to the neoconservatives saying, come on in, the water's fine. In other words, why don't you just drop your FDR, just drop that last little bit you're hanging on to and just join us conservatives. And one of the things Buckley was great about was a movement builder. Like, he didn't disavow the neocons. He might have had some big disagreements with them, but he recognized, hey, if you're going to throw off the shackles of the Great Society and sort of, the direction it's been going, and disavow LBJ and especially the New Left that emerged in the 1960s, we can make common ground here, even if you maybe have an anthropology that is a little icky to us, if you will. And I guess this is kind of me getting back to that original thought of a post, Trump conservative party, or rather a Republican Party, if it's to be resuscitated. It probably is of necessity going to be that we're going to have to make common ground with the people at the Bulwark, with the people that thought Trump was, the greatest thing since sliced bread, and it's going to get really uncomfortable in a manner that's going to be a bit of a dance. So again, there's probably not much of a question there. And Scott, if you had any thoughts, I know you hadn't had a chance to speak in a while. I'll defer to you.
No, that's all right. I had some thoughts on what we were talking about previously, but your comment just now about having to make common cause with the Bulwark is a more useful launching ground for the thought I had. I'm going to push back on that idea somewhat. And I know you didn't want us to use Bill Kristol as a punching bag here, but I'm going to use him as a punching bag for a second to illustrate the point.
It's so tempting.
Too easy. Yeah, let's go for it.
Well, to agree with what you said about Irving Kristol, the difference between Irving and his son and the sort of first wave of neoconservatives and Kristol's rendition of the idea is that the first wave of neoconservatives, regardless of what their prior positions were and what their new positions became, understood that the purpose of politics, rightly practiced, is to help most people in most places live better lives than they live in the moment. And the ways in which we talk about doing that might differ between the parties. That was the principle. And the reason they moved from left to right is because they thought that the left had failed to do that, and they saw that the right, and particularly on crime, that was an issue that Irving Kristol cared about deeply. The new left's lackadaisical approach to crime really bothered him, and that's why he moved to the right. Bill Kristol, whatever else his faults are, does not seem to operate with that idea in mind. Right? For him, and this is a problem with the intellectual class, left and right broadly, and something that we fall into ourselves often, unfortunately, is too focused on ideas qua ideas, and not so much about how they apply to the world at large. That's how he justifies voting for Mamdani. There is no world in which voting for Mamdani makes the lives of most New Yorkers and most parts of Manhattan better. But as an idea, it's to stop Trump or to stick it to Trump. It makes perfect sense, and that's how we can justify it. For a post-Trump Republican Party to work, I don't see a lot of room for us to make lots of common cause with people whose first thoughts about politics are not how are we going to make the lives of most people better, but how are we going to either A, debate some esoteric idea that has no practical application, or B, define ourselves in opposition to a single man, regardless of the consequences where it might be. I think there's a lot more opportunity to make common cause with people who are like friends of yours who are probably more pro-Trump than anybody on this panel. Because for all of Trump's flaws, and for all of some of his supporters' flaws, the thrust of the movement seems to be the lives of most people are flagging. How can we improve this? That is where the future of the party is going, should be. Because if we fall back into this position of here are some first principles that make perfect sense in the abstract, and when applied, come up with all these really odd scenarios where Bill Kristol ends up voting for a socialist. That seems a step back into a world that led to Trump in the first place.
I think the measurement of that is going to be, just looking at the nerdy data side of things, which I also love, is basically 2024 was the first time more independents voted than Democrats as far as registration goes, right? Which is not good for the Democratic Party, I would say. Obviously, I think you're right. Most people are just going, most of the people I talk to, and there's people that are all in on Trump, there's people, but a lot of people were just like, I felt better off economically when he was president than I did when Biden was president. And
Yeah.
That's really what it boiled down to for the most part. It really was voting on, going back to Josh's thing. It's like, it's not united. It's not the workers of the world. It's just like, am I doing okay? Am I making more money than I was? Like, no one really cares about everyone else. Like, we're all selfish, and that's okay. Like, that's essentially why Trump got reelected, is because Biden did such a terrible job on inflation and the economy. And I do think presidents get too much credit and blame sometimes for the economy, but it is very obvious that like Biden's direct actions of spending all that money, and by the way, not just Biden. It was all of Congress that did it too. Trump did his little thing that was inflationary, and then Biden just was like, hold my beer. I can do better. And so they both are to blame, but people don't blame Trump because it was at the end of his presidency. And so he wins in 2024. I think the measurement of it in 2026, this year in the midterms, but more so in 2028 are going to be, will Republicans defect from the Republican Party? Or will it just be more independents swinging back and forth between parties? Because that's what we've done since 2016, essentially. We're actually 2012, if you really want to think about it. We just kept going like, no, I don't feel like anything, like that's not what I wanted. Like we just want the economy to be better. Like, and then they, Obama has his giant things he wants to do. Trump has his giant things he wants to do. Biden has his giant things he wants to do. And people just keep kind of, to me, going to the polls and saying, that's not what we asked you to do. We didn't ask you for a moonshot. We asked you to keep inflation below 2%. It's like, that's all we're asking for. Will enough, to me, that will be the only thing that says, okay, we might be going in a good direction, is if Republicans can get off the defending Trump kind of thing. And it doesn't seem like they are, because if they're leaving the Republican Party to become independents, to me, that's a different thing than saying, hey, I'm going to stay a Republican, but I'm not voting for someone that's like Trump and not like the American First populism or something like that. To me, that'll be the measurement. It's very clear that in 2024, we had look at those debate stages. You had a lot of people that I think were very qualified to be president, maybe more so than in my life. You got a bunch of governors, which I always think make better presidents because they have the executive kind of, maybe that's an unpopular opinion, but I feel like they're at least a little more ready for the job than like a senator, like you said, Josh. Will we pick someone that's capable, or will we go for the kind of like populist mud slinging? And
Blake, is it okay to beat up on Biden now? Isn't he like an old sick guy?
It was always okay. It's always okay to beat up on Biden. Look, I think that the second you get in politics, you are signing up for it's okay to beat up on you, and it doesn't matter if you're old and frail. If you make that many bad decisions, we get to call you out on it.
No, but he's not just old and frail, man. He's got major.
He will not live till the end of this term. There's no way, right? Does anyone think he will? Right.
Well, I don't know, because I have had dear friends and relatives that have gone through similar cognitive decline, and they can hang on for many years. And they're just, it's a terrible illness. They could just be a shell of themselves, but still physically here. And you bringing that up, it reminded me, because I think it is worth saying that I think part of the concern sometimes is that, or let me rephrase it this way. I've had people tell me how terrible it is that the American people as a whole did not choose Kamala Harris because she, in a sense, represented the restoration of the Democratic project. And I don't mean capital D Democrat as in the party. I mean the American experiment, in a sense.
Right.
And that they just didn't care enough about that, and so they vote for a would-be authoritarian. And look, I think there's something to that. Maybe the correct move would have been whoever the Democratic Party had nominated. The vast majority of Americans vote for them, to say, no, we will not put a person who actively tried to steal an election back in the White House. I think there's some merit to that. But I think part of what's going on, and we mentioned the bulwark, and I certainly see this in the Democratic Party too, is an unwillingness, I think, sometimes to engage with the notion that this is not this side bad, that side good. This is rather a large a loss in a failure of institutions across the board. Now, I don't mean that we can't point to certain individuals or parties or institutions and say they are in some ways crazier or worse or have gone further than others. But it is not true that over the last 10 years, the Democratic Party has been this paragon of virtue. And, and as, Exhibit A, what the Biden administration pulled over, trying to pull the wool over our eyes for as long as it did. And so this is, I think, sometimes my biggest concern with the bulwark approach, if you will, is it's not as if Mamdani is the alternative, if you will, right? It's not that the alternative is a return to the pre-Trump era. And I'm not here to say that every Democrat is that way. Every Republican is not that way. I think there's still some God-fearing, wonderful people in both parties working as hard as they can. But I do think it's difficult sometimes when you're standing here looking around saying, it sure seems like both parties are fundamentally not taking their duty serious.
No, not at
It's
all.
hard to know,
Yeah.
what do you do?
So,
Oh, go
Josh,
ahead.
I was gonna apologize to Blake. Blake, I wasn't trying to virtue signal, man. I was just trying
No.
to ask the question: how come we're not attacking the party? And so
No.
Josh read my mind, and he said,
Totally with you. Yeah.
okay,
No,
attack the party.
Biden's just the stand-in for, because now we
Yeah.
think of presidents as, the whole party
yeah.
is a mess, and there's no virtuous. I mean, I don't even think the people that are like heads down doing the best they can are doing a good enough job, because to me, not calling out these things that are very clearly, like, really, like I said, whether it's, I realize maybe these are my hobby horses or whatever, but to me, they're very obvious. Like, the debt is a problem, the spending is a problem, the fact that, again, none of this has worked. Like, you've never shown us that it can even work. We're just spending all this money. Look at I think the biggest problem, and the reason populism is so popular right now, is because I think everyone feels like there's the two tiers of, well, the people that are connected. I mean, Trump is literally saying out loud that he's just going to pardon everyone. We knew that happened with Biden and the Democrats, and we also know, I think the Democrats, the biggest thing they did that was bad was that the attempt to cover up Biden's cognitive decline was basically, Dean Phillips is the only person that gets a pass, because he's the only person that came out there and said he can't be the president again. Like, I support him, I like his policies, but he cannot do this for 4 more years, and someone's got to say it. And the fact that no one else would say that in the Democratic Party, I mean, you would be ostracized if you even mentioned that maybe it's a bad idea. And so, to me, that lost a lot of trust. And then you've got all these pardons for family, and then you got Trump doing similar things. I think everyone feels like there's 2 tiers of justice. I also saw this thing the other day that said we are prosecuting fewer white collar crimes than ever, basically, in the history of the country under the second Trump. It's just been going like this under Biden and Trump. And so Trump, it is like, I mean, the chart was like Clinton was up here, kind of at the height of it, and George W. Bush, and literally the Trump was like down here. I know we're only 1 year in, but it was doing it by year in the presidencies. To me, those are really, like, people are paying attention to that like, if you are a certain tier, you can do whatever you want, and it's like this class of people. And I think people are really tired of that, but they are revolting against both parties at the same time for that.
So can I tie in what Scott said and what Blake has just said? So Scott mentioned that we face a risk of having these abstract ideas, and then Blake's just given us a great example about how people want practical outcomes. So how do we find that balance? I think we need ideas, but you said you love Burke, Josh. I love Burke too. You know, Burke warns against we should avoid the nakedness and solitude of metaphysical abstractions, and so that's for Scott there. So we don't want abstractions, but we also want to call people to ideas. If we just simply promise them tax cuts and lower cost of living, and we're going to give you jobs, I mean, those are important things. Of course, we need those, but if we don't do that armed with an argument, it becomes virtually demagoguery, right? That's how I get elected as a union boss. I'm going to promise you higher wages and more time off. And so how do we differentiate then? One of the profs I was talking to said, well, demagogues, Shawn, they flatter the public. So they don't really promise the public what they want. Okay, well, I see politicians doing a lot of flattering of the electorate as well. So to Blake and what Scott just said, sorry, I'm pointing at you guys on the screen here. You know, how do we get that space between practical politics, but also offering an articulate defense of some of the ideas that we think are going to lead to a flourishing society? So I don't have the answer there. Sorry, Josh, I'm not supposed to be asking the questions here.
That's okay. It's a good question.
I think the answer might be, I mean, this is happening some places. I mean, I think it was Virginia that they cut enough like red tape in building permits and inspection times and things like that to cut. It was like $25,000 off the cost of a new house. I mean, that's significant, right? And they didn't, without like just scrapping safety stuff or anything like that. They literally just said, okay, we're going to get inspections done faster because time is money. And by the way, this was like this is a group of 4 people that are working in that were basically, it's like the Doge, but actually worked. And it was like 4 people. And like they did cut all this red tape. And so people in that state are seeing a real, like, you know, tires to the pavement kind of version of, hey, here's an idea. the bureaucracy has too much power and in like keeping the building of your house or whatever the thing is, or occupational licensing reform is another one where to me there's just such a clear, it's like, hey, we don't need all these rules. We don't need all of this. Like the only people that benefit from this are the special interests that want there to be regulation so that they can keep people out of their industry. Like that's a practical thing that I think is actually working at the city and state level. In some cities and states, they're actually doing it. Meanwhile, you look at California. I have not checked the ticker the last time, but the last time I checked it, they had approved like 13 building permits for the fires since it's been whatever, a year at that point, at least over a year. And it was literally like 20. It was in the dozens. It was not even in the hundreds yet. And you've got, what was it, 10,000 buildings that were destroyed in that fire. Like that to me is where people are like, I'm super frustrated with government. But unfortunately what they do is instead of going, is this a bad idea and it doesn't work, populism or handouts or whatever it is, throwing money at the problem. You got Minnesota with all the corruption with the their stuff with the federal funds for the COVID stuff. All these kind of things are examples that piss people off. And what they do is they say, if you were responsible for it, I'm going to vote for the other guy that's promising me the same kind of stuff. Yeah. It's like they haven't learned that those promises are empty. And I think that until we learn that, we will just keep volleying back and forth between inept parties and leaders that promise things that they can't ever. Most of the time they're making promises they can't ever fulfill. And sometimes that's literally at the level where, like, in presidential debates, they are promising things that we do not give the president the power to do. And yet you're just setting yourself up for failure, because if you say, I promise you I'm going on Kamala Harris did this in 2020. She said, day one, I'm banning assault weapons. She does not have the power to do that. She has to know that if she got past the Democratic primary and got elected, there's no way she can do what she's saying she's going to do. And people are going to be mad that you told them that you could do it, right? I don't know why people haven't learned that and don't like hold back a little bit. The only person I saw in the Republican debates was Nikki Haley going with the abortion question. She was kind of going like, guys, you have to have a filibuster proof majority. So until we've got 60 Republicans in there, it's just not possible. We could talk about it till we're blue in the face. But to me, that was a really good example of saying we could talk about this idea all we want, but practically it's not possible yet. And I think it was kind of refreshing because most people just will not admit that, hey, that's not my job. I would love a presidential campaign to get up there and be like, it's actually not my job. That's Congress's job. Supreme Court keeps doing it over and over again in their decisions. Like there's always this line in there that's like, but Congress could do this, but they just don't take the hint.
I think it was in the 2020 election, Elizabeth Warren said if elected, she would abolish the Electoral College.
Right.
Yes. How are you going to do that one? And granted, it was Donald Trump that was going to end the war between Ukraine and Russia on day one.
24 hours, yeah.
But, within 24 hours, yeah.
Simple.
So simple. Yeah, trade wars are easy also.
Yeah.
By the way, so I want to ask you that, kind of going off of Shawn's question, I want to point this to you, Scott, because in my view, you sort of, and I don't know if you're intending to do this, but you sort of hit upon the answer earlier when you were quoting the biographer of Abraham Lincoln. How do you get those practical results as far as and I think Blake gave the very practical answer of, from the ground up, how housing reform and tax cut and all these things we can see, as the old in these very blue states, as I've heard it said, even their voters are like, look, I might be on board with your progressive programs, but I just want the city to work first. And then let's talk about, equity for, I don't know, lesbian poet writers or something like that.
Pave the roads, make sure the trains are running. It's like, these are like do the basic city stuff well, and then let's talk about it. But they don't ever do that, right?
And that is something that both the left and right can do. But I guess I'm saying Lincoln, I think, had this. And by the way, I want to ask you, Scott, were you quoting Harry Jaffa? And was that the biographer you were talking about?
Yes, it was. I said biography because
Awesome.
I read a Lincoln biography alongside Jaffa's work, but that line is from one of, I want to say, at The Crisis of the House Divided.
I read it in The Crisis of the House Divided, so I know it's in there, yeah. But Jaffa even mentions that this is the template. I think that was the temperance speech, if I'm not mistaken. This is the template he thought for how a politician could equate the passions of the people to move them in a direction that is good and pure, such as the abolition of slavery.
that's
Sorry,
that's,
again, I
that's
don't know if there's a
correct.
question there, but yeah. Did you have any other thoughts on that? Because it's been a while since I read it, so I wasn't sure if you could elaborate any more on that. If you can't, that's fine. We can go
No,
back to
I
other
think
uh,
I think I like any young aspiring statesman. Lincoln is the model. I love Lincoln. I love reading Jaffa. I read the biographies of him. Yeah, the quote, and I wish I could remember the exact line, is that the statesman services the ignoble but not immoral desires of the people so as to establish trust with them, so that when it comes time to answer these great moral questions of the day, the people have faith in it. And this is something that statesmanship as a craft has been lost in America largely. I don't know if you could name 5 people in the entire nation who qualify as statesmen, even of the second and third tier, and certainly not of the first.
Yeah.
But this is, as Blake alluded to, and as Shawn alluded to, and as you have alluded to, people first and foremost, to quote Henry Adams, because I'm always quoting him, and I thankfully have an opportunity to do it here. People want a system that works, and they want men who can work it. And everything else comes second to those premises. But once you've achieved that, and you need people who can achieve that, can be competent and create a system that works for the people and work the system on their behalf, then you can address these sort of timeless first principles that we want to address. And so what we need in America, as cliche as it sounds, is for people who are willing to be honest enough with the American people to not lie and not say, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z in the first 24 hours. Say, no, here's what I can do. And then to actually achieve those results. And you will find that the American people reward such politicians. I think we want competence. And if you can do those two things, if you can be competent and honest, they will give you the latitude to attempt to attack these sort of larger moral and ethical discussions that we have in society that maybe aren't kitchen table discussions.
I wonder if I've got the same thing. I'm going to ask questions, even though it's not my podcast to ask questions. But I'm wondering if I read an article. I can't even remember what it was in, but it was saying like the rise of sort of competency porn, like loving the Artemis launch stuff and the Pit. A lot of people love watching the Pit, just like love watching people. I know the Pit is a fictional show, but like watching people be really good at their jobs and really competent in their jobs. It seems like that it is kind of the anti-social media thing right now, is some of these kind of things. And I wonder if it seems like that is people wanting that, right? It seems like to me they're going just desperately saying, I would love someone that could just do the things. But unfortunately, I guess I think the problem is that the way the primaries are set up, we are just doomed to fail because most of those people that want the competency either don't vote in primaries or like everyone just knows they got to go for the base, and the base is now pretty fringe in both parties in the sense that you're going to get a Mamdani and you're going to get a Donald Trump, or you're going to get a like pick your people. It's like pretty bad. And I think part of that, there's 2 things that I think are happening. I think that one, why would the competent people want to? People are always asking me like, are you going to run for? I was like, why would I would hate that job. Like, there's no way I want to go into that group of people. And I think we're eliminating competency and smart people and people with good ideas and people that can be honest from even wanting the job, because everyone thinks of it like a power play now. No one thinks of it like a service to your country. No one thinks of like running for Congress and going there for like a few years and then going back home and doing your normal job. No one does that anymore. I mean, we have one from our state when I was a kid, but that's like, it's happened like twice in my lifetime of the people that I even represent. They eventually either lose, but very rarely do they just leave, like not being even 90 years old. And Dianne Feinstein was just like dying in the Senate. It's like, it's crazy to me that was going on. Do you all think that for conservatism to, or even competent democratic kind of stuff on that side, do you think that one of the parties has to like totally flame out for that to happen? Like, I can't find a way that it doesn't without one of those parties like kind of dying or losing for a long time.
Can I jump in there, Josh?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So competence porn. I love that. That's a great.
Yeah.
I hadn't heard that term, so that's good. Competence porn. And I wanted to jump on Scott's comment about competent and honest. And I thought, I love that. That sounds great. but does that exist anymore? So, Scott, you're a glass half full guy, or maybe rose-colored glasses guy, and this has been something that's keeping me awake at night. And again, to nerd out, Aristotle talked about tropos, right? You need the kind of people and a kind of a system. So disposition of the people and the nature of the system have to match each other for a system to function. And I believe it was one of the Adams, I don't know if it's John or Henry, Scott, you'll correct me on this, but he said, the American regime is only suited for a people of faith or a people of a certain kind of disposition. It's not going to function otherwise. And so if the nature of the country changes, and you haven't adjusted your political system's not going to work so well. So Blake's question about, is this going to flame out? That's what keeps me awake at night. And we say, well, how do we change the disposition of the people? Well, it requires leadership. Well, what kind of leadership? Community leadership in our institutions, leadership in our academic institutions. You think of Julian Benda's book, I can't say it in French. Was it Treason des Clercs or Treason of the Intellectuals? And he was actually saying that fascism arose because of the intellectuals didn't do their job to insulate the voters, the public, society against these kind of ideas. Well, I would say exactly the same thing's going, but in reverse, right? We're not insulating the voting demographic against some of these DEI, intersectional politics is what I've been calling it lately. Some of the weirdo ideas that we get up that we've been talking about here. So competent and honest, Scott, competency porn, Blake. This is what's worrying me. I'm worried that even if you did have a competent and honest leader, is that really what the voting public wants? Because they seem to love guys who come in and break stuff like Trump did. But he made room for people to do some creative, innovative solutions. So I don't think everything he did was bad. Yes, he broke a lot of stuff, but he also made room for some innovation to happen. So I don't know if that's too provocative. Josh, you'll never invite me back for saying something nice about Trump.
So I wanted to, if I might respond to that first and then respond to something Blake said. So the quote that you pulled is from John Adams. It's funny that you mentioned that if a people changes, the system that services them has to change as well. The quote I pulled from Henry Adams, people want a system that works and men who can work it. He wrote about the Grant administration, post-Civil War, a world in which the system in which the American people had changed drastically from our early Republican roots, and the system of governance that we hadn't caught up yet. And that's why he was talking about that. The point he was making was that the Grant administration was very corrupt, that Congress was inept, that our government was incapable of grappling with the modern world that we found ourselves in 1870. And it notably took 20, 30 years for the system to catch up, and America sort of muddled through in that time. But it did eventually. That's why I'm glass half full. The naivety and arrogance of youth, the time span that America works on, I think, is longer than just the moment, the next moment. I also wanted to push back on something Blake said. He mentioned that why would a competent person, honest person, want to run for office, right? This is a slugfest, it's a mess. That mentality begets the very problem that we're talking about, and that competent and honest people simply don't run for office. And as they stop running for office, somebody worse does and wins, thereby justifying why the competent person didn't run for office in the first place. It is, again, probably naive and youthful of me to say, the only way to fix this and to get back to a world in which reasonably decent people and reasonably competent people are in positions to work the system, to build a system that works and then to work it, is for them to run, is for them to treat office as a public service or some position. I am an unelected official of the state of Florida. I work for the state, right? To do public service for the sake of doing public service. It's not a power play. We don't do it for personal aggrandizement, right? And to understand that even if you lose, pick up and you run again, or somebody like you runs again, and you do it in service of the people and not yourself.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Hopefully, my point
Blake,
there, I was sort of rambling.
And I'll give you an opportunity to respond to that, Blake, if you want to also, but we're running low on time, so I'm going to offer opportunity for closing comments for each of you guys this evening. I will take a brief stab at your question, Blake, in that there is, I suppose, an alternative to. I mean, you could be right that maybe the only way we get out of this sort of death spiral is one of the two major parties flames out so badly, is out of power for so long that they're finally like, well, this sucks. Let's do something different. It's also conceivably possible that the American people writ large could begin demanding better from both parties. And it could, and as I share your hope, I hope it does not come to this, but a crisis is something that can cause people to embrace a bit more maturity when this stuff, because let's be frank, a lot of these elections don't really matter because our lives are not that terrible. We're not at threat of invasion or I know times are difficult and stuff, and inflation's been rough, but we're not going through anything that our ancestors had, nearly that awful. And I think that can mature people. Again, hope it does not come to that, but that can also sort of break the fever, if you will. I do. I'm hanging out here on those words. You've said them twice, Scott, quoting Lincoln about the igniting or I guess it was rather quoting Jaffa, igniting the ignoble but not immoral passions of the people. Lincoln had done that in terms of not slavery at the time, but temperance. This idea that, hey, there's a lot of wrong with alcohol. Why don't we just ban this stuff? And eventually we did. It didn't quite work out. But that idea began, I think Jaffa even said that it was uncertain at the time when Lincoln was first running for office whether or not it would be slavery or temperance would be the main moral issue of the nation, which sounds so bizarre, like slavery or temperance. Those don't sound like equally weighty moral questions. But it was a big deal for people. They saw a lot of rot and awful things that happened because of the excesses of alcohol, and they wanted to ban it. And Lincoln, in his brilliance, recognized that there is a lot of good desire embedded in that. But there's a bad way to go about it, to just straight up ban it. So we really need a culturally spiritual revival, if we will. And he used that passion of the people to try to direct it in a means of making us a more whole society, not just trying to outright ban something. I don't think Lincoln was necessarily a flaming libertarian, but I think he better understood, that the just the outright to ban sin doesn't necessarily make sin go away. And
It's
so
almost never has. Yeah. It's never worked.
Almost never has. Yeah. you can text, in our, I was thinking, Blake, since you and I are both in Oklahoma, I was thinking back in Mary Fallon's administration, when we were going through the budgetary battles, somebody in the Tulsa World had made the statement, because they passed a budget that they put all these sin taxes in. And somebody in the Tulsa World said, okay, Oklahomans, it's time for us to gamble, drink, and smoke our way out of this debt crisis.
Yeah.
And I just thought that was just the beautiful, there's something wrong here.
Right.
But anyhow, I'm with you, Scott, that I'm not necessarily holding out hope that the next Abraham Lincoln is just around the corner. Heck, I'd settle for a James Garfield or somebody, even at a lesser tier, but still a decent person. But I do think that we can reasonably expect and demand and hope that people of noble, honest character would step up and learn how to speak to that populist impulse, those ignoble populist impulses, in a way that is moral. And I do think it is, I called mine. I've got a guest coming up here. I'll be recording in a couple of weeks. She's Han Chinese, and her great mission is to speak out against the CCP. That puts it in perspective for me. I think there's a lot more hope the Republican Party can embrace conservative principles than the CCP could somehow relinquish control, although that could happen too. As bad as things are, they could be a lot worse. And I do think there is still, I'm still going to try, hopefully for another 8 years, we'll see, get another crack at it. Maybe we can make some headway here. But I want to give each of you gentlemen, we've had a lot of discussion, a chance for your closing thoughts, if only to remind us again how bad Bill Kristol has gotten it, or whatever else you have on your mind before we close out for the evening.
So I'll jump in, and I wanted to pick up on your comment about hope. So I think, and this is something that's been rolling around in my head, I think conservatism advances on the promise of hope. Liberalism advances on the assumption of progress. There's probably other bright dividing lines between the two philosophies. And I'm not saying everything about liberalism is bad. There's some great ideas in there too, but I just think it's it's not a robust enough and broad enough philosophy. We mentioned Claremont a few times and Strauss. I enjoy reading Strauss. However, the Claremontsters get a little bit too vociferous and argumentative for me. So I thought I'd poke the bear a bit and then have Scott come to their defense. I do like Jaffa. I like Marini too. His administrative state book is awesome. So I'm not slamming them all, but I do find them to be rather argumentative types. And so, Scott, you can argue back at me in their defense in your closing remarks. But the other side of the aisle from Strauss is Burke. And so we have to give, I mean, this is going to make me super nerdy, but Burke brings out the tragic sense of our situation. He talks about loss, but the age of chivalry is gone, right? He talks about loss. And I think if we approach our politics from a fundamental starting point of loss, a tragic sense, we're capable of great things, but man, we sure find ways to screw things up, and really, and speaking personally, right? But certainly in politics as well. So it brings a sense of humility to what we do, but it also has that echo of hope. So, never, never more shall we behold that generous loyalty to rank and sex, that proud submission, obedient, the dignified obedience, that subordination of the heart that keeps alive, even in servitude itself, the spirit of an exalted freedom. So grabbing hold of that spirit of an exalted freedom, or the unbought grace of life, the cheap defense of nations, the nurse of manly sentiment and heroic enterprise is gone. And he's talking about chivalry and how the glory of Europe was really rooted in this era that had already disappeared. But he said, hey, this is something that we can learn about, we can grab a hold of, and we've got chivalrous, heroic people in our own lives, in pioneers settling our two great countries. And so there's a tragic sense, a sense of loss. That's our starting point, but also a sense of great hope and inspiration, and to say, wow, look at what we could have here. So I just wanted to throw out a poke in the eye of the Claremontsters, and then a shout out for Burke. And congratulations on 8 years, Josh. I'm looking forward to 8 years more.
Thanks, Shawn.
Truth be told, Shawn, the only Claremontster I've ever read is Jaffa, and only his two books on Lincoln. I have some Strauss to read eventually, so you can poke fun at the Claremontsters all you want. Jaffa's the only one. I myself am more of a Burke and Kirk man. Anyway, as I was sitting here trying to think about what my closing remarks are, I was reminded that the first question and the impetus of the conversation was whether the GOP was worth saving, and my answer to that was the affirmative. And I broadly speaking, I say that because institutions in America outside the GOP, and including the GOP, but not solely the GOP, I think are worth saving. There are lots of things in America that need renewal. GOP is just one of many. And I think they're all worth saving because I think America is worth working for. And I think America can be renewed. It can be saved. It can be brought back to a position that we can be proud of again. And so the GOP is just one avenue for that. Whatever avenue conservatives take, whether it's GOP or not, we should get past the shell shock of the last decade. We've been paralyzed by this shocking feint from the side that knocked us off our high horse and out of the ivory tower and out of our position of authority, and so left us stranded and scrambled and scattered across the nation. It is time to get past that and get to work. And whether that's within the GOP or some other institution, something must be done. And the only way to fix any of these things is to work at it day in and day out and day in and day out. My last line is a quote that I am fond of saying that people, it's funny coming from a conservative, but I like. There will be time enough to be pessimistic when the job is finished. Right now, there is work to do. So it's time to get to work.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think that I'm with you. I think I just don't know if it is possible that that's how it's going to go down. But I mean, I do think that all these institutions are worth saving because it's not. I think that they're very necessary. I think that the institutions are, and by institutions, I really do mean like across the board. I don't just mean like the Senate and the GOP and the Democratic Party. I mean like, your local school board and like all these kind of things matter. And I think we're not putting enough. We've got a bunch of people that kind of want to use the institutions for their own glory or power or fame or whatever. And we're not really, I think, taking enough care of them. And I wish someone would take more care of the GOP. I mean, I do think that it's become a thing that we just relinquished to Donald Trump. And that bothers me a lot because it's not really a Republican Party anymore. It's just whatever Trump says, that's what we have got to do. So to me, that's not worth saving. But if we could get the institution back to be talking about ideas again, because I think you're absolutely right, Shawn. The Democratic Party, progressives don't really have it's really all about what they're against. It's not really what they're for so much. It doesn't, it's very hard to find the through line. They're trying to be too much to everyone, in my opinion. I would like, and the GOP is kind of going in the complete opposite direction. They're trying to be everything to just one person, which is kind of a funny dichotomy there. So I think you're right. I think it could change as quickly as there's only two things I think that will change it. It's either a crisis, which I don't want to happen, but I do think is the kind of thing that can rally the troops, so to speak. I also think one really talented person, which I imagine there's got to be these people, especially maybe it's another actor like Ronald Reagan. I mean, it's got to be someone that can speak and like I said, simplify some of these ideas. Not that many of them are hard to understand conceptually. Go back to the Virginia thing. It's not hard to understand that like this red tape equals $25,000 off the cost of your house. Like that's an easy thing, but really, I don't talk to anyone that knows about that. I'm sure Virginians do, but to me, that should be something that everyone's paying attention to and then exporting that to other states. There should be other governors that are trying to go, we should put together a board like that so that I can brag about it. Even if the motivation is, I want to get reelected again. You know what I mean? That's okay for that to be the motivation. I think the problem is no one is thinking more than 2 years ahead, basically, ever in politics right now. Everyone's thinking, what do I have to do to get reelected? And that's it. That's the entire focus. No one is thinking about 5-year plans, 10-year plans. And we really need more of that. We really do need some, hey, this is going to take a little while, but here's how this is going to work. And people that are willing to try that thing, do that thing, even if it doesn't mean they get to be in power when they see it actually be in fruition. I think that person has to be out there. It's trying to find those people that can articulate what those plans are and what the ideas are. And then also, I think I think people are really searching for a non-politician. I keep going back to, I think the reason people liked Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump is because they seemed authentic. They were not pretending to be anyone. Donald Trump had his full suit on at the McDonald's because he's not going to put on like the McDonald's uniform. That's not Donald Trump. And you can say a lot of bad things about him, but I think that he is genuinely himself. And I think Bernie Sanders is a similar thing. I think that's what people were attracted to in both of them. I think the reason Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris are not attractive to people is because they seem so phony. And so I think it's got to just be someone that's authentically themselves, even if they have unpopular opinions. I think people are really forgiving of you not checking off all the boxes in the Republican Party very clearly. I mean, that's not the case with the Democratic Party at this point. If you don't follow all the exact rules, you cannot be a pro-life Democrat right now, but you can obviously be Donald Trump, who really is not very conservative at all and has taken over the Republican Party. So this party seems to be more open to that kind of thing, which gives me that hope to say that maybe we can, like, someone with better ideas could come in and we'd be like, oh yeah, that actually we could go with that. I think it'll happen on the Republican Party before it happens in the Democratic Party, basically, is what I'm saying.
I will let you gentlemen have the last word. So we're going to leave it at that. Shawn, Scott, Blake, thank you all so much for taking the time to hang out with us, and thank everyone else out there for taking the time to watch us. We will see you guys next time.
Thanks for listening to the Saving Elephants podcast. Be sure and subscribe for future episodes. Do you have a topic or question about conservatism, millennials, the Republican Party, or anything else that you'd like us to cover in a future podcast? We would love to hear from you. Email us at savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. That is savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and catch our weekly Friday blog posts at savingelefantsblog.com. That is savingelefantsblog.com. Join us next time as we reignite conservatism for millennials.